Maria Lorraine Hunzel. On the evening of February 7, 1977, in Colorado Springs, 14-year-old Maria Lorraine Hunzel was babysitting two young children at a neighbor's apartment in the 5400 block of North Nevada Avenue. The neighbor had left Maria in charge while stepping out for the evening, trusting the responsible teenager with the care of their sleeping children. When the parent returned shortly before midnight, they discovered Maria in the master bedroom, having been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. The children remained asleep and unharmed throughout the incident. First responders initially suspected the scene might have been something other than foul play, but the El Paso County Coroner's Office quickly determined through autopsy that Maria's death was a homicide. The crime scene revealed no signs of forced entry, suggesting that either Maria knew her attacker or someone had gained access through unlocked doors. She was found wearing a blue jumpsuit, and investigators documented blood evidence throughout the bedroom where the incident occurred. The investigation that followed involved extensive interviews with neighbors, family members, and anyone who might have information about Maria's final hours. Detectives collected physical evidence from the scene, including the blood-stained jumpsuit Maria had been wearing. Despite following numerous leads and interviewing many individuals, investigators were unable to identify a suspect. The case eventually went cold, joining countless other unsolved homicides from that era as evidence sat preserved in storage. Decades passed with no resolution. The blood stain on Maria's clothing yielded a male DNA profile that was entered into the combined DNA index system, but no matches were found in the database. The evidence remained carefully preserved, waiting for technology to advance enough to provide new investigative avenues. Maria's family endured 47 years without answers, holding on to hope that someday they would know who had taken their daughter's life. The breakthrough came in 2019 when investigators submitted the DNA evidence to Parabon Nano Labs, a company specializing in genetic genealogy. The laboratory uploaded the perpetrator's DNA profile to public genealogy databases where millions of people had voluntarily submitted their genetic information to learn about their ancestry. By identifying distant relatives who shared genetic markers with the unknown perpetrator, genealogists began building elaborate family trees using newspaper archives, public records, census data, and other historical documents. This painstaking genealogical work eventually led investigators to William Charles Kernan Jr., known as Bill to those who knew him. Kernan was a local college student at the time of Maria's death and had connections to the apartment complex where the babysitting occurred. He had been an acquaintance of the neighbor who employed Maria that evening and had visited the complex on previous occasions. The investigation revealed that Kernan had access and opportunity, though investigators never established a clear motive for the attack beyond possible opportunism. However, justice in the traditional sense would prove impossible. Kernan had died in 2010 and been cremated, more than a decade before investigators identified him as Maria's killer. With no living relatives available to provide confirming DNA samples and no body to exhume for direct comparison, the case was exceptionally cleared due to the death of the offender. While this meant no trial would occur, the identification provided the closure Maria's family had sought for nearly 5 decades. Colorado Springs Police issued a statement acknowledging the long wait for justice, noting that the family and friends of Maria Hunzel had waited over 47 years to get answers. They expressed pride in finally providing resolution through years of analysis and investigation using advanced genetic genealogy techniques. Family members, speaking to media outlets, expressed profound relief at finally knowing who had killed Maria. Even though Kernan's death meant he would never face earthly consequences for his actions, the next case would also involve years of waiting before technology could identify the perpetrator. Carmen Van Huss. On March 23, 1993, 19-year-old Carmen Hope Van Huss was found deceased in her Indianapolis apartment, having been stabbed multiple times. Her father made the terrible discovery the following day when he went to check on his daughter. The scene showed clear signs of a violent struggle. With furniture overturned, clothing scattered throughout the space, and blood pooling near where Carmen had fallen. The door to the apartment was ajar, though investigators found no evidence of forced entry. A resident living in the apartment below Carmen's provided crucial information to investigators. This witness reported hearing disturbing sounds the night before, including screaming, crying, and loud banging that continued for approximately 30 minutes. The witness also heard male voices arguing and specifically recalled hearing Carmen cry out, pleading to be left alone. Despite these alarming sounds, no one called authorities until Carmen's father discovered her the next day. The investigation involved interviewing residents of the apartment complex and collecting physical evidence from the scene. Detectives documented blood stain patterns, collected biological evidence, and began building a timeline of Carmen's final hours. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have seen or heard something relevant. Despite these efforts, no clear suspect emerged, and the case eventually went cold. For 31 years, Carmen's case remained unsolved. Her family lived with the pain of not knowing who had taken Carmen's life. Carmen had been a college student with her whole future ahead of her, and her death left a permanent void in the lives of those who loved her. The breakthrough came in 2018 when investigators submitted crime scene DNA to Parabon Nanolabs for genetic genealogy analysis. By uploading the perpetrator's genetic profile to public genealogy databases, specialists began the complex work of building family trees. This process took years of careful research. By 2023, investigators had identified Dana Germaine Shepherd, then 52 years old, as a strong suspect. The investigation revealed a chilling detail that had been overlooked decades earlier. Shepherd had been a neighbor living in an adjacent building that was connected to Carmen's building through a shared laundry area. He had lived in close proximity to Carmen and would have had easy access to her building. In June 2024, investigators obtained a warrant to collect a DNA sample from Shepherd. The comparison confirmed what genetic genealogy had suggested. Shepherd was arrested in Missouri in August 2024 and faced charges that could result in over 100 years in prison. When officers presented Shepherd with the warrant, witnesses reported that he appeared visibly shaken. He invoked his right to remain silent and made no statements. As of late 2024, he was awaiting extradition to Indiana. Carmen's brother Jimmy spoke to media about the resolution, expressing gratitude. He reflected on how many people had missed Carmen over the decades and noted that she never got to experience her college graduation or wedding. His words captured the lasting impact of her loss. While this case took 3 decades to solve, the next investigation would face different challenges entirely. Marianne Vatstra. On the morning of May 1st, 1999, 16-year-old Marianne Vatstra was found deceased in a field near the village of Veenklooster in the Netherlands. She had been cycling home alone after attending a party in a nearby village the previous evening. Her body was discovered in a rural area not far from the route she would have taken. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small Dutch community and triggered what would become one of the most controversial investigations in Dutch forensic history. The initial investigation involved collecting DNA evidence from the scene and interviewing numerous individuals. Despite these efforts, no suspect was identified in the immediate aftermath. The case took a troubling turn when suspicion fell on asylum seekers living in the area, leading to public protests and even riots targeting immigrant communities. These demonstrations reflected ugly prejudices and assumptions that the perpetrator must have been an outsider, when in fact the killer was someone much closer to home. For years, the investigation made little progress despite significant resources being devoted to solving Marianne's case. The DNA profile from the scene remained unmatched in databases, and traditional investigative methods failed to identify a viable suspect. The case became emblematic of the limitations of forensic technology at the turn of the millennium, even as DNA analysis was becoming more sophisticated. In 2012, Dutch authorities made the controversial decision to conduct a mass DNA dragnet, requesting voluntary DNA samples from thousands of men in the region. This unprecedented operation involved collecting samples from men who lived in the area, focusing on those who might have been present at the time of Marianne's death. The scale of the operation raised significant ethical and privacy concerns, sparking debates about the balance between solving crimes and respecting civil liberties. The dragnet eventually produced a familial DNA match that led investigators to Jasper Staringa, a local farmer who lived in the community. Staringa was not an outsider or a stranger, but rather someone who had been part of the area all along. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Staringa made a decision that surprised many observers. Rather than forcing his family to endure a lengthy trial and the continued publicity that would come with it, Staringa chose to confess to his involvement in Marianne's death. He stated that he wanted to spare his family the pain of a prolonged legal battle and public scrutiny. His confession provided details about the encounter that aligned with the physical evidence collected from the scene. Investigators learned that the attack appeared to have been an act of panic and opportunism, rather than something premeditated. Staringa was prosecuted and received a significant prison sentence for his actions. The resolution of the case led to important discussions in the Netherlands about forensic techniques, privacy rights, and the use of mass DNA testing. The case ultimately redefined aspects of Dutch forensic practice and influenced legislation regarding DNA collection and usage. It also served as a stark reminder of the dangers of rushing to judgment based on prejudice rather than evidence. For Marianne's family, the resolution brought answers after 13 years of uncertainty, though it could never undo the loss they had suffered. The next case would reveal an even more disturbing twist involving wrongful conviction. Angie Dodge. On June 13, 1996, 18-year-old Angie Dodge was found deceased in her Idaho Falls apartment, having been stabbed and harmed in a brutal encounter. The discovery devastated her family and community, launching an investigation that would span more than 2 decades and involve a tragic miscarriage of justice before the truth finally emerged. The case would ultimately demonstrate both the fallibility of traditional investigative methods and the redemptive power of modern DNA technology when properly applied. The initial investigation collected biological evidence from the scene, including material that would later prove crucial to identifying the actual perpetrator. However, investigators at the time focused their attention on Christopher Tapp, a young man with no connection to Angie, who became entangled in the case through questionable interrogation tactics. Tapp was pressured into providing a confession that implicated himself and others, despite having no actual knowledge of the crime. The confession was filled with inaccuracies and contradicted physical evidence from the scene, but prosecutors proceeded with charges against him anyway. Tapp was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. He would spend 20 years behind bars while the actual perpetrator remained free and unpunished. Throughout his incarceration, Tapp maintained his innocence, and advocates began working to prove his claims and expose the flaws in his prosecution. The DNA evidence from the scene had never matched Tapp, but this crucial fact was explained away or minimized during his prosecution. Experts who reviewed the case later would express shock at how such obvious exculpatory evidence could be ignored. Angie's mother, Carol Dodge, became a relentless advocate for finding the truth about who had killed her daughter. Even though Tapp had been convicted and was serving his sentence, she recognized that the DNA evidence told a different story. Carol pushed for continued investigation and testing, refusing to accept that justice had been served when the evidence clearly pointed to someone else. Her persistence in the face of resistance from authorities who considered the case closed would ultimately prove instrumental in solving the case and freeing an innocent man. In 2017, genetic genealogy emerged as a promising new tool for solving cold cases, having gained attention through its use in other high-profile investigations. The DNA profile from Angie's case was uploaded to public genealogy databases, and specialists began the complex work of building family trees to identify the perpetrator. This process led investigators to Brian Lee Dripps Sr., who had been living as a neighbor in the same apartment complex where Angie lived at the time of her death. The proximity was chilling. He had been right there all along. Dripps had been interviewed briefly during the original investigation, but had not been considered a serious suspect, despite his close proximity to Angie. He had known Angie casually as a neighbor, seeing her in common areas and around the complex, which gave him both access and opportunity. When confronted with the DNA evidence in 2019, Dripps admitted to his involvement in Angie's death. He provided details that aligned with the physical evidence and explained that the encounter had begun as an intended assault that escalated into a fatal confrontation when things went wrong. The identification of Dripps led to immediate action to free Christopher Tapp. In 2019, Tapp was exonerated and released from prison after serving 20 years for a crime he did not commit. The wrongful conviction became a cautionary tale about the dangers of coercive interrogation tactics and the importance of following DNA evidence rather than forced confessions. Legal experts pointed to the case as an example of confirmation bias, where investigators focused on making evidence fit their theory rather than following where evidence actually led. Dripps was charged with Angie's murder and ultimately pleaded guilty to the charges, receiving a significant prison sentence that would keep him incarcerated for decades. The case resolution brought mixed emotions for those involved. While Angie's family finally knew the truth about who killed her and could begin to find closure, they also had to grapple with the painful fact that an innocent person had spent 2 decades in prison while the actual perpetrator remained free. Carol Dodge expressed both relief at the resolution and sorrow for Tapp's lost years. The case sparked important discussions about wrongful convictions, the reliability of confessions obtained through aggressive interrogation, and the need for reforms in interrogation practices. It became a teaching case in law schools and police academies about what can go wrong when investigators prioritize theory over evidence. The Idaho Falls Police Department eventually acknowledged errors in the original investigation, a rare admission that helped validate concerns about how the case had been initially handled. Another investigation would connect seemingly unrelated cases through DNA. Kathy Hall. On March 20th, 1979, 19-year-old Kathy Halley vanished after leaving her workplace at a shoe store in North Aurora, Illinois. She had finished her shift and headed toward the bus stop for her commute home, but she never arrived. Her disappearance triggered immediate concern from her family, who knew Kathy's reliable nature made her absence alarming. Days later, her body was discovered in a wooded area, ending hopes that she might still be found alive. The investigation revealed that Kathy had been harmed in a violent encounter. Evidence collected from her clothing and the scene was preserved using the best available methods of that era. Investigators interviewed numerous individuals and followed various leads, but no suspect was identified despite extensive efforts. The case went cold, becoming one of many unsolved homicides from that period that haunted law enforcement and left families without closure. The evidence from Kathy's case remained in storage for decades as forensic technology evolved around it. In 2024, investigators decided to re-examine the case using modern techniques. They employed a specialized wet vacuum DNA collection method to extract genetic material from Kathy's clothing, a process that could recover DNA from fabrics even after many years. This technique successfully yielded a male DNA profile that could be compared against databases in other cases. The comparison produced a startling match. The DNA profile linked to Bruce Lindahl, a name that was already infamous in Illinois law enforcement circles. Lindahl was a known serial offender who had been connected to multiple cases of harm against women in the Chicago area during the late 1970s and early 1980s. His pattern of offenses had escalated from assault to more serious crimes, terrorizing the region during his active period. Lindahl's criminal career had ended in a particularly unusual manner. In 1981, he died during an attempted attack when his intended victim fought back. The encounter resulted in Lindahl's death, bringing his series of offenses to an end, but leaving many questions unanswered about the full extent of his activities. At the time of his death, investigators had connected him to several cases, but technology did not exist to link him definitively to others. The DNA match to Kathy Howell's case 4 decades after Lindahl's death finally provided answers to her family. The connection explained what had happened to Kathy and placed her case within the broader context of Lindahl's pattern of violence against women. North Aurora Police announced the resolution in 2024, noting that while Lindahl could never face justice in a courtroom, the identification provided closure for Kathy's loved ones. The next case in this set would involve an unusual path to resolution. Nicole Vanden Hurk. On November 6, 1995, 15-year-old Nicole Vanden Hurk disappeared while cycling from her home in Eindhoven, Netherlands, to work at a supermarket. When she failed to arrive at work and did not return home, her family reported her missing. Her bicycle was found abandoned along the route she would have taken, and a search was launched to locate her. Her body was discovered 2 months later in a wooded area, having been left there after she was harmed. The initial investigation collected evidence from where Nicole was found, but identifying her attacker proved difficult. DNA evidence was collected, though the technology available in 1995 was far less sophisticated than what would emerge in subsequent decades. The case went cold as investigators exhausted their leads without identifying a viable suspect. Nicole's family endured years without answers about what had happened to her and who was responsible. In a bizarre twist that would eventually help solve the case, Nicole's stepbrother Andy confessed to her harm in 2005, a confession that shocked both investigators and the family. However, Andy's confession appeared to be strategic rather than truthful. He claimed to have taken this drastic action specifically to force authorities to conduct new DNA testing on evidence from Nicole's case. Andy believed that modern DNA technology could identify the real perpetrator if police would only re-examine the evidence with fresh techniques. Andy was prosecuted based on his confession, but the case against him was complicated by the lack of physical evidence connecting him to the crime. Meanwhile, authorities did proceed with new DNA testing on Nicole's remains, which required exhumation and reanalysis using advanced methods. The probabilistic genotyping techniques available by the early 2000s could analyze mixed or degraded samples that were impossible to interpret with older technology. The new testing revealed DNA that did not match Andy, but instead pointed to someone else entirely. The profile matched Jos de G, a man with a psychiatric history who had been convicted of other offenses. Further investigation revealed that Jos de G had been in the area where Nicole disappeared and had opportunity to encounter her. The evidence built a compelling case against him as Nicole's actual killer. Andy's false confession was eventually proven to be exactly that, and he was cleared of the charges against him. His gambit to force new DNA testing had worked, though at great personal cost of being prosecuted for a crime he did not commit. Jos de G was prosecuted and convicted of Nicole's harm in 2014. Nearly 20 years after her death, he received a significant prison sentence and remains incarcerated. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would involve the youngest victim and a neighbor hiding in plain sight. Anne Pham. On January 8, 1982, 5-year-old Anne Pham disappeared while walking to her kindergarten in Seaside, California. The little girl had left her house that morning to attend school, a route she had taken before. When she failed to arrive, teachers notified her family, and a frantic search began immediately. The small coastal community mobilized to look for Anne. Days later, her body was discovered in a wooded area not far from her neighborhood. The discovery devastated the community and launched an investigation that would span 4 decades. Evidence was collected from the scene using the forensic methods available in the early 1980s. Despite extensive efforts, the case went cold. The evidence from Anne's case was carefully preserved over the decades. Among the evidence was a hair sample that had been collected from the scene. For years, this hair seemed to offer limited value because it lacked a root, which was typically necessary for DNA extraction using traditional methods. However, as forensic science advanced, new techniques emerged. In 2022, investigators submitted the evidence to a laboratory capable of analyzing rootless hair using cutting-edge methods. The analysis successfully yielded a DNA profile that was uploaded to genetic genealogy platforms. This process led investigators to Robert John Lanoux, who had been living in the same neighborhood as Anne at the time of her disappearance. Lanoux had been a neighbor, living close enough to have regular opportunities to observe her routines. He was an Army veteran who had settled in Seaside. When investigators approached him with the DNA evidence, Lanoux admitted to having a history of harmful behavior toward young girls, acknowledging a pattern that had begun years before Anne's death. His admission suggested she had not been his only victim. The investigation revealed that Lanoux had been living an outwardly normal life for decades while carrying the secret of what he had done to Anne. He had maintained relationships, held jobs, and presented himself as an ordinary member of society. The revelation shocked those who had known him. Lanoux was charged with Anne's case and faced prosecution in Monterey County. In 2024, Lanoux was convicted and received a life sentence in prison, ensuring he would never again pose a threat. He would spend the remainder of his days incarcerated. For Anne's family, the resolution brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. They finally knew who had taken their daughter and why she had never made it to kindergarten that January morning. The 40-year wait for answers had been excruciating, but advancing forensic science had finally provided the closure they needed. While Anne's case involved a neighbor, the next investigation would reveal a perpetrator with a badge, Sherry Rasmussen. On February 24, 1986, 29-year-old Sherry Rasmussen was found deceased in her Van Nuys, California, home by her husband when he returned from work. Sherry was a successful nursing director at a local hospital who had recently married her husband, John Ruetten. The scene suggested a violent confrontation had taken place in the couple's condominium, and investigators initially theorized that Sherry had surprised burglars during a break-in gone wrong. Evidence collected from the scene included a bite mark on Sherry's arm, which would prove crucial decades later when DNA technology advanced. The initial investigation by the Los Angeles Police Department focused heavily on the burglary theory. Despite some aspects of the scene that did not fit typical burglary patterns, certain items of value remained untouched, and the violence seemed excessive for a typical property crime. Sherry's husband mentioned to investigators that his ex-girlfriend, Stephanie Lazarus, who was an LAPD detective, had been unhappy about his marriage to Sherry and had even confronted Sherry on at least one occasion. However, this lead was not pursued vigorously, possibly because Lazarus was a fellow officer and the suggestion that a detective could be involved seemed improbable to investigators at the time. The case eventually went cold, as the burglary theory failed to produce viable suspects despite extensive investigation. Items that had been taken from the home were never recovered, and no arrests were made. The investigation file was eventually archived, and the case joined thousands of other unsolved homicides in Los Angeles County. For over 2 decades, the case remained unsolved, filed away in storage. Sherry's family never stopped believing that the burglary theory was incorrect and that someone with a personal connection to Sherry or her husband was responsible for her death. They continued to press the LAPD to re-examine the case, particularly the lead involving Lazarus that had been mentioned early in the investigation. However, their concerns were repeatedly dismissed or minimized by investigators who seemed reluctant to consider that one of their own might be involved in such a serious crime. The institutional resistance to investigating a fellow officer would later become a major point of controversy. The breakthrough came in 2008 when a detective reviewing cold cases decided to have DNA extracted from the bite mark on Sherry's arm, evidence that had been preserved since the original investigation. The analysis yielded a female DNA profile, immediately calling into question the burglary theory, which had focused on male suspects. The profile was run through CODIS and other databases, producing a match to Stephanie Lazarus, who had continued working as an LAPD detective for over 20 years since Sherry's death. The match was shocking to investigators, revealing that a law enforcement officer had been responsible for the crime all along. Further investigation uncovered the motive and circumstances surrounding Sherry's death. Lazarus had been romantically involved with John Rueton before he married Sherry, and evidence suggested she had been unable to accept that the relationship was over, even after Rueton's marriage. Witnesses came forward describing Lazarus's behavior as obsessive and her reaction to the marriage as extreme. She had allegedly confronted Sherry at her home while Sherry was alone during the day, and the encounter had escalated from confrontation into a fatal struggle. The bite mark had occurred during the violent encounter, leaving DNA evidence that would eventually identify Lazarus as the perpetrator. Lazarus was arrested in 2009 in a carefully planned operation, shocking the LAPD and the broader law enforcement community. The revelation that a detective had committed such a crime and then continued working in the department for decades raised serious questions about the original investigation and whether there had been any cover-up or deliberate avoidance of obvious leads. Internal reviews examined how Lazarus had been overlooked as a suspect, despite being mentioned early in the investigation and having a clear motive. The trial took place in 2012, with prosecutors presenting the DNA evidence along with testimony about Lazarus's obsession with Rueton and her inability to move on from their relationship. The defense attempted to challenge the DNA evidence and suggest alternative explanations, but the scientific proof was overwhelming and irrefutable. Witnesses testified about Lazarus's behavior before and after Sherry's death, painting a picture of someone consumed by jealousy. The jury convicted Lazarus of first-degree intentional harm, and she received a sentence of 27 years to life in prison. She has since been denied parole multiple times and continues to maintain her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against her. The case exposed significant failures in the original investigation and raised serious concerns about how law enforcement investigates crimes, potentially involving their own members. For Sherry's family, the resolution vindicated their long-held belief that the burglary theory was wrong and that someone close to the situation was responsible. The 23-year delay in justice was attributed to institutional reluctance to investigate a fellow officer and the primitive state of DNA technology in the mid-1980s. The next case would connect multiple incidents through DNA evidence. Holly Ann Campiglia. On November 12, 1980, 21-year-old Holly Ann Campiglia disappeared after leaving her job at a Fresno, California, shopping mall where she worked as a waitress. Holly had finished her evening shift and was last seen in the parking lot heading toward her car. When she failed to return home and did not show up for her next scheduled shift, her family reported her missing. A search was launched throughout the Fresno area, with volunteers and law enforcement combing through possible locations. Days later, Holly's body was discovered in a cornfield in rural Fresno County, far from where she had last been seen. Evidence was collected from the scene and from Holly's remains, including biological material that was preserved using the forensic methods available in 1980. Investigators interviewed numerous individuals and followed various leads, but despite extensive efforts, no suspect was identified. The case went cold, and Holly's family endured decades without knowing who had taken her life. The evidence from Holly's case remained in storage as forensic technology advanced dramatically over the following decades. Holly's family never gave up hope that the case might someday be solved. They periodically contacted law enforcement to inquire about new testing methods and to request that the evidence be re-examined with modern techniques. Their persistence kept Holly's case from being forgotten entirely. In the early 2020s, the family's advocacy resulted in the evidence being submitted for advanced DNA analysis. The reanalysis using modern methods yielded a DNA profile that could be compared against databases containing millions of genetic profiles from convicted offenders and other sources. The comparison produced a match to Herman Lee Hobbs, a man who was already serving time in prison for other serious offenses. The investigation revealed disturbing connections. Hobbs had been convicted and imprisoned for multiple cases involving harm to others, including young victims. His pattern of offenses had escalated over time, with Holly apparently being one of his earlier victims. The DNA match to Holly's case was part of a broader review that linked Hobbs to multiple unsolved cases from the late 1970s and early 1980s in California. In 2023, Hobbs was charged with Holly's case while already serving multiple life sentences for his other convictions. The additional charges ensured that Hobbs would never be released from prison, though he had already been facing life imprisonment. For Holly's family, the identification of Hobbs provided answers after 43 years of uncertainty. They finally knew who had taken Holly and could begin to process their loss with the knowledge that he was permanently incarcerated. The case demonstrated how DNA databases containing profiles from convicted offenders could solve cold cases by matching evidence from unsolved crimes to individuals who had committed other offenses. It also highlighted patterns where perpetrators escalated their behavior over time, with early cases sometimes remaining unsolved until later convictions provided DNA samples for comparison. Another case would reveal connections to a series of infamous incidents. Lori Ann Powell. On August 9, 1988, 18-year-old Lori Ann Powell was found deceased in a wooded area near the Colonial Parkway in Virginia. Lori had been stabbed multiple times, and her body showed signs of a violent encounter. The location of the discovery raised immediate concerns for investigators familiar with the area. The Colonial Parkway had been the site of several mysterious cases during the 1980s, and Lori's death appeared to fit a troubling pattern. The investigation collected evidence from the scene, including biological material that was preserved for future analysis. Detectives interviewed individuals who had seen Lori in the days before her death and explored various theories about what had happened to her. Despite these efforts, no suspect was identified, and Lori's case became one of several unsolved incidents associated with the Colonial Parkway region that haunted investigators for decades. The Colonial Parkway cases had long been a source of frustration for law enforcement. Multiple young people had died or disappeared along this scenic route during a relatively short time period, leading to speculation about whether a serial perpetrator was responsible. However, evidence linking the various cases proved elusive for years, and the investigations remained separate as investigators worked each case individually. In 2025, a major breakthrough occurred when DNA evidence from Lori's case was analyzed using advanced techniques and compared against genetic genealogy databases. The analysis identified Alan W. Wilmer Sr., also known by the nickname Pokey, as a match to the DNA evidence. Wilmer had been a fisherman and tree service owner in Virginia who had died in 2017, 8 years before being identified as connected to Lori's case. Further investigation revealed even more disturbing connections. Wilmer was subsequently linked through DNA evidence to 3 additional cases of young women who had died in the late 1980s in Virginia. The pattern suggested that Wilmer had been responsible for multiple deaths during this period, possibly operating as a serial offender who had evaded detection for decades. The timing and locations of the cases he was linked to aligned with the broader pattern of incidents associated with the Colonial Parkway region. Because Wilmer had died in 2017, he could never be prosecuted for the crimes he allegedly committed. However, the identification provided crucial answers to families who had waited decades for resolution. The Virginia Office of the Attorney General announced the developments in November 2025, noting that investigations into potential additional connections were ongoing. Authorities were reviewing other unsolved cases from the same era and region to determine if Wilmer might be connected to even more incidents. For Lori's family and the families of the other victims linked to Wilmer, the resolution brought a complicated mixture of emotions. They finally had answers about who was responsible. But Wilmer's death meant he would never face trial or be held publicly accountable. The next investigation would end with an unexpected confrontation. Deborah Lee Miller. On March 25, 1981, 18-year-old Deborah Lee Miller was found deceased in her Mansfield, Ohio apartment. Deborah had been harmed in a violent encounter involving both blunt force and other means, and the scene suggested a sustained confrontation. She lived in a multi-unit building, and investigators quickly began interviewing neighbors and collecting evidence from her apartment and the surrounding areas. Among those interviewed was James Van Est, who lived in an upstairs apartment in the same building. Van Est provided investigators with statements about his whereabouts and activities during the relevant time period, but his accounts would later prove to be false. At the time, however, investigators had insufficient evidence to challenge his statements or connect him definitively to Deborah's death. The case eventually went cold as leads were exhausted and no clear suspect emerged. Evidence from the scene, including biological material found on various items, was preserved and stored. The evidence included mixed samples that were difficult to analyze using the technology available in the early 1980s. DNA analysis was still emerging as a forensic tool, and the sophisticated methods needed to separate and identify mixed profiles did not yet exist. The evidence waited in storage for technology to advance enough to provide useful information. In 2024, investigators submitted the evidence for advanced DNA analysis using modern techniques capable of separating mixed DNA profiles and identifying individual contributors. The analysis successfully extracted a male DNA profile that could be compared against databases. The comparison yielded a match to James Van Est, the former neighbor who had been interviewed back in 1981. Armed with this evidence, investigators approached Van Est to question him about the case in 2021, decades after the original interviews. He attempted to provide an alibi and explain away the DNA evidence, but his new statements contradicted what he had told investigators in 1981. When investigators sought to question him again in 2024 with the definitive DNA results, Van Est refused to cooperate or provide any additional statements. The investigation revealed more about Van Est's background. He had a history of previous convictions and had been barred from possessing weapons due to his status as a convicted offender. Despite this, he had continued to engage in criminal behavior over the decades. Investigators prepared to arrest him and bring charges related to Deborah's death. However, the case took an unexpected turn in November 2024. Vanest was killed in a confrontation with police during an unrelated arrest attempt. Officers were attempting to apprehend him on different charges when the situation escalated, resulting in an exchange of fire that left Vanest deceased. The circumstances prevented him from ever standing trial for Deborah's case. Law enforcement announced the resolution of Deborah's case in late 2024, noting that DNA evidence had definitively identified Vanest as responsible for her death 43 years earlier. While the resolution provided answers for Deborah's family, Vanest's death during the unrelated incident meant that he would never face formal charges or trial for what he had done to Deborah. The case was exceptionally cleared due to the death of the suspect. The final case would involve the longest gap between crime and arrest. Dawn Momohara. On July 26, 1977, 16-year-old Dawn Momohara disappeared after leaving her family's home in Honolulu, Hawaii. Dawn had attended McKinley High School and was well liked by classmates and teachers. When she failed to return home that evening, her family reported her missing, triggering a search throughout the Honolulu area. Days later, her body was discovered in a location that indicated she had been harmed after disappearing. The investigation in 1977 involved interviewing numerous individuals, including Dawn's classmates, friends, and anyone who might have seen her on the day she disappeared. Evidence was collected from where Dawn was found, including her clothing, which bore biological material. Among those interviewed was Gideon Castro, who had been a classmate of Dawn's at McKinley High School. Castro provided statements to investigators, but was not charged at that time. The case went cold as investigators were unable to definitively connect anyone to Dawn's death using the forensic methods available in the late 1970s. The biological evidence was preserved, stored away as DNA technology was still years from being developed and applied to criminal investigations. Dawn's family endured decades without answers, hoping that someday advancing science might provide the closure they sought. The breakthrough came in 2020 when DNA testing was performed on the preserved evidence with assistance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The analysis of genetic material found on Dawn's clothing yielded a male DNA profile. When this profile was compared against databases, it matched Gideon Castro, the former classmate who had been interviewed back in 1977. The match probability was overwhelming, providing definitive evidence of his involvement. By the time investigators identified Castro in 2020, he was living in a nursing home in Utah. He was in poor health, suffering from conditions including paralysis and cognitive impairment that had developed over the years. Despite these health challenges, authorities in Hawaii sought to bring charges against him for Dawn's case. In January 2025, Castro was arrested and charged with what had happened to Dawn 48 years earlier. However, the case took an unexpected turn when the prosecutors reviewed the evidence and circumstances. In March 2025, the case against Castro was dismissed due to concerns about evidence integrity and the availability of witnesses after so many decades. Prosecutors determined they needed more time to investigate and strengthen the case before proceeding. Castro was released from custody due to his health conditions and returned to the nursing home where he had been living. As of late 2025, the investigation remained officially open. Prosecutors indicated they were continuing to review evidence and explore whether charges could be refiled with a stronger case. The dismissal did not mean Castro was cleared, but rather that legal and evidentiary issues needed to be resolved before prosecution could proceed. The unusual situation left Dawn's family in a state of limbo, having received identification of a suspect only to see charges dismissed. Fawn Marie Cox. On July 26, 1989, Authorities in Kansas City, Missouri, responded to a residence where a young person had been found deceased in a second-floor bedroom. Fawn Marie Cox, born March 24, 1973, had been helping support her family through part-time work, selling amusement ride tickets, while also participating regularly in church activities. The family lived in a two-story house in an area struggling with economic challenges and elevated criminal activity. The incident occurred during the night while other family members were sleeping downstairs. An intruder had accessed Fawn's bedroom through an open window, climbing onto a nearby trailer to reach the second floor. The window had been left open due to the lack of air conditioning in the summer heat. Items were stolen from the home, including electronics like radios, a Nintendo console, and a stereo, with some discarded outside the residence. An unfamiliar army cap was found at the scene. Forensic investigators collected crucial evidence from the bedroom, including hair samples, blood, and biological material from bed sheets. This evidence was preserved using methods available in the late 1980s, though DNA technology was still in relatively early stages. The evidence would remain in storage for over 3 decades before advancing technology could unlock its secrets. The investigation initially focused on 3 teenagers who had confessed to a break-in and theft at the residence. These individuals served time for theft charges, but DNA testing would eventually clear them of any involvement in Fawn's death. The case went cold as investigators exhausted leads. The crime rattled the Kansas City community, particularly affecting the detectives who never forgot about the young person taken from her own bedroom. For 31 years, Fawn's family lived without answers. The breakthrough came in November 2020 under Operation Legend, a federal initiative supporting local law enforcement in solving cold cases through advanced DNA techniques. The biological profile developed from the 1989 evidence had been uploaded to CODIS, but produced no matches. Investigators then sent the profile to Parabon Nanolabs, which built a detailed family tree by comparing the DNA against public genealogy databases. The genealogical analysis identified Donald Cox Jr. as a potential suspect. Shockingly, Donald was Fawn's 21-year-old cousin and a frequent visitor to the family home, making him familiar with the residence layout. This familiarity would have allowed him to know about access points and possibly to have hidden inside before the attack. The dark truth was that someone the family knew and trusted had been responsible. Investigators located a DNA sample from Donald Cox Jr., collected during a 2006 investigation into his death from a suspected overdose. When compared to the biological evidence from 1989, it matched perfectly. However, justice in the traditional sense was impossible because Donald had died in 2006, 20 years before being identified as the perpetrator. The case was officially closed as exceptionally cleared, and Fawn's family was notified. Fawn's sister Felicia expressed frustration that if their family had been wealthier or more influential, every possible step would have already been taken to find closure. Captain Ben Caldwell reflected that the case had touched many people because Fawn had been an innocent young person taken from her own bed. The next case would also reveal a perpetrator who evaded accountability through death. Laura Kempton. On September 28, 1981, authorities in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, discovered 23-year-old Laura Kempton deceased in her Chapel Street apartment. Laura had been a vibrant Portsmouth beauty school student who also worked at a local gift store. Known for her outgoing personality, free spirit, and distinctive new wave fashion sense, she was well liked in the community. On the evening of September 27th, Laura had been socializing with friends before returning to her apartment alone. An intruder broke into her residence during the night. The perpetrator attempted to carry out a serious assault before harming Laura with a glass bottle, causing massive head trauma. Investigators discovered Laura's body had been covered with a mattress, and her ankles had been tied with an electric blanket cord. Forensic investigators collected extensive evidence from the apartment, including biological samples, blood, fingerprints, and a cigarette butt left behind by the perpetrator. This evidence was preserved and would prove crucial decades later. The scene suggested a calculated break-in that had escalated. The investigation involved interviewing Laura's friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen suspicious activity. Despite extensive efforts, they were unable to identify a suspect using the investigative tools available in the early 1980s. The case gradually went cold, though it was never closed or forgotten. For 42 years, Laura's family endured not knowing who had taken her life. The resolution came in 2023, when forensic genetic genealogy was applied to DNA evidence from the crime scene. The DNA profile was analyzed by Identifinders International, leading investigators to Ronnie James Lee, who had been 21 at the time of Laura's death. Further investigation revealed disturbing details about Lee's background. He was a U.S. Army veteran with a documented pattern of concerning behavior. In 1987, 6 years after Laura's case, Lee was convicted of burglary and assault charges in Keene, New Hampshire. He served prison time until 1990, suggesting he had continued engaging in similar criminal activity after Laura's death. However, traditional justice was impossible to achieve. Lee had died in 2005 from complications related to substance use, 18 years before being identified as Laura's killer. New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella expressed hope that this conclusion would provide whatever closure the criminal justice system could offer. The Kempton family acknowledged the diligence of investigators, which had led to this moment after more than 4 decades. The case was officially closed as exceptionally cleared. The dark truth was that Lee had lived another 24 years after taking Laura's life, potentially committing other offenses, before dying without ever facing consequences. While those cases ended without trials, the next would bring different challenges. Deborah Stone. On September 2, 1984, the body of 24-year-old Deborah Stone was discovered in Narrow River in Narragansett, Rhode Island. Her remains had been found bound inside a sleeping bag that was tied to a cinder block, clearly indicating foul play. The discovery launched an investigation that would span over 4 decades before reaching resolution, though the path to solving the case would take unexpected turns. The investigation established that Deborah had visited the apartment of Robert D. Jeremiah on August 29, 1984, several days before her body was discovered. Jeremiah was known in the area as someone involved in illicit substances, and Deborah had apparently gone to his apartment seeking such materials. According to information that would later emerge, a dispute arose between them, with Jeremiah claiming that Deborah had stolen from him. Investigators learned through an informant that Jeremiah had made statements about having to take action against Deborah because of the alleged theft. These statements suggested that he had killed her in response to the dispute over stolen items. However, proving what had happened proved difficult with the forensic tools and investigative methods available in the mid-1980s. The case went cold as investigators were unable to gather sufficient evidence to charge Jeremiah with Deborah's death. Over the following decades, the case remained unsolved, with Deborah's family left without justice or closure. Jeremiah, who had been a notorious figure in the local substance trade, died in 1995 from natural causes, 11 years after Deborah's death. His death appeared to end any possibility of bringing someone to justice for what had happened to Deborah in Narrow River. However, the case was reopened in recent years as part of a comprehensive review of cold cases by Rhode Island authorities. The breakthrough came in 2025 through a combination of re-interviewing witnesses and applying modern understanding of investigative techniques. Investigators re-interviewed 32 witnesses whose statements had remained consistent over the decades, building a comprehensive picture of what had occurred. The re-investigation also involved applying modern knowledge about polygraph examinations and interrogation techniques to evaluate evidence and statements from the original investigation. This fresh look at the case, combined with advances in understanding how to analyze witness credibility and consistency, allowed investigators to build a strong case connecting Jeremiah to Deborah's death, even though he had been deceased for 3 decades. While DNA analysis was part of the broader investigation into Rhode Island cold cases during this period, the resolution of Deborah's specific case relied more heavily on the witness testimony and reinvestigation of the circumstances surrounding her death, rather than on genetic evidence alone. The consistent statements from witnesses over 40 years, combined with the informant's account of Jeremiah's admission that he had to take action against Deborah, provided the foundation for closing the case. Narragansett Police Chief Kyle Ricas spoke about the resolution, noting that for over 4 decades, Deborah's family had remained without answers after her life was tragically cut short. The announcement that the case had been solved brought some measure of closure to Deborah's family, though it came with the frustration that Jeremiah had died 30 years earlier without ever facing formal charges or trial. The case was officially closed as exceptionally cleared due to the death of the suspect. The dark truth revealed was that Jeremiah, a dangerous figure involved in the local substance trade, had taken Deborah's life over a dispute about stolen items and then lived another 11 years before dying. The resolution demonstrated that even when perpetrators die before being charged, thorough reinvestigation using modern techniques can still bring answers to families who have waited decades for closure. But the next case would involve a perpetrator who lived to face justice. Pamela Sumter. In 1990, authorities in Stone Mountain, Georgia, investigated the disappearance of Pamela Sumter, a woman who had been reported missing by concerned family members. The investigation would eventually reveal that Pamela had been harmed along with her sibling. With both cases remaining unsolved for over 3 decades before DNA technology would identify the person responsible and reveal dark truths about his background and activities. The details of what happened to Pamela emerged gradually over the years as investigators worked to piece together the circumstances of her disappearance. The case involved complex forensic challenges given the time period and the condition of evidence. For 34 years, Pamela's family sought answers about what had happened to her and who was responsible for taking her life. The breakthrough in Pamela's case came through advances in DNA technology and the development of forensic genetic genealogy techniques. Investigators utilized both a rape kit that had been preserved from the original investigation and connections to the National DNA Database to build a profile that could be compared against genealogical records. This combination of traditional forensic evidence and cutting-edge genetic analysis would prove crucial to identifying the perpetrator. The investigation led to Kenneth Perry, who had connections to Detroit and a documented history of prior offenses involving assault against women. Perry's criminal background revealed a pattern of predatory behavior, and his mobility across state lines had apparently helped him avoid detection for decades. The genetic genealogy analysis connected him to relatives whose DNA was in public databases, allowing investigators to narrow down potential suspects until they identified Perry as matching the biological evidence from Pamela's case. Unlike the previous cases where perpetrators had died before being identified, Perry was still alive when investigators connected him to Pamela's death. He was arrested and faced prosecution for what he had done over 3 decades earlier. The evidence against him was strong, combining the biological evidence that had been carefully preserved with the genetic genealogy findings that specifically identified him as the source. DeKalb County prosecutors described the case as transforming from seemingly unsolvable to having solid evidence thanks to the combination of preserved forensic materials and modern DNA analysis techniques. The prosecution presented the case to a grand jury, which indicted Perry on charges related to both Pamela's death and her siblings' death, as investigators had connected him to both cases through the genetic evidence. Perry proceeded through the legal system and was ultimately convicted of the charges against him. The court sentenced him to life in prison plus 100 years, ensuring that he would never be released and would spend the remainder of his life in custody. Substantial sentence reflected both the severity of taking 2 lives and the additional charges related to the circumstances of the crimes. For Pamela's family, the conviction brought a sense of justice that had seemed impossible for over 30 years. While nothing could restore what had been lost, seeing Perry held accountable provided closure and the knowledge that he would never harm anyone else. The case demonstrated the power of preserving forensic evidence even when cases go cold, as that evidence can become crucial when technology advances. The dark truth revealed in Pamela's case was that Perry had been moving between states and continuing to live freely for decades after taking her life, potentially putting other women at risk during those years. His pattern of behavior suggested that earlier identification might have prevented additional harm to others. As of 2025, Perry remains incarcerated, serving his life sentence. Another case would involve different circumstances, but similar use of technology. Helena Prushinsky. On January 16, 1980, 21-year-old Helene Prushinsky was found deceased in a rural area near Douglas County, Colorado. Helene had been an intern at a local radio station, excited about beginning her career in journalism and starting what should have been a promising life ahead of her. She had been walking home from work when she was abducted, and her body was discovered the following day. The crime shocked the Denver metro area and launched an intensive investigation. Forensic evidence was collected from the scene and from Helene's body, including biological material that would be preserved for future analysis. Despite extensive efforts by investigators, including interviews with numerous potential witnesses and exploration of various theories, no suspect was identified using the investigative methods available in 1980. For nearly 40 years, Helene's case remained unsolved, though it was never forgotten by the Douglas County Sheriff's Office or by investigators who periodically reviewed the evidence, hoping for new leads. The case became one of Colorado's most frustrating cold cases, with a young woman's promising life cut short and no one held accountable for decades. The breakthrough came in 2019 when genetic genealogy was applied to DNA evidence from the case. The DNA profile from the biological evidence was uploaded to genealogical databases and analyzed to build family trees connecting to potential relatives. This analysis led investigators to James Curtis Clanton, a truck driver who had been living under an alias and had a history of similar offenses in other jurisdictions. Further investigation revealed disturbing details about Clanton's background. He had prior convictions related to assault in other states and had apparently been using false identities to evade detection and move freely across the country. His occupation as a truck driver had given him mobility and the ability to commit crimes in different areas, while avoiding connection to any single law enforcement jurisdiction. Clanton was arrested and extradited to Colorado to face charges related to Helene's case. The evidence against him included the DNA match confirmed through genetic genealogy, as well as other investigative findings that placed him in the area at the time. During legal proceedings, prosecutors presented the scientific evidence along with circumstantial evidence connecting Clanton to the crime. Clanton was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Helene's family spoke about their relief at finally having answers and seeing justice served, with one family member noting that Helene had been just starting her life when it was taken from her. The conviction ensured that Clanton would never be released and would spend the rest of his life in custody. The dark truth revealed in Helene's case was that Clanton had been using aliases and his mobility as a truck driver to evade law enforcement for decades. His pattern of offenses in multiple states suggested that he had harmed other women during the years he remained free after taking Helene's life. The case highlighted how genetic genealogy could identify perpetrators who had successfully hidden their identities and avoided traditional law enforcement databases. As of 2025, Clanton remains incarcerated serving his life sentence. The next case would reveal another perpetrator who had hidden in plain sight. Anna Jean Kane. On March 14, 1988, authorities in Pennsylvania discovered the body of 26-year-old Anna Jean Kane in Lackawanna County. Anna Jean was a young mother who had been living in the area and building a life for herself and her family. The circumstances of her death indicated foul play, and investigators launched an extensive investigation to identify who was responsible for taking her life. Forensic evidence was collected from the scene, including biological material and other physical evidence that would be carefully preserved. However, what made Anna Jean's case particularly unusual was that investigators also received a letter that would later prove crucial to solving the case. The letter, apparently sent by the perpetrator, contained statements about the crime and would eventually provide DNA evidence that could be analyzed decades later. Despite the evidence collected, including the letter, investigators were unable to identify a suspect using the forensic and investigative tools available in the late 1980s. The case went cold as leads were exhausted, though the unusual circumstance of having a letter from the apparent perpetrator meant that investigators remained hopeful the case could eventually be solved if technology advanced sufficiently to extract usable DNA from the correspondence. For 34 years, Anna Jean's family lived without answers, knowing that evidence existed but unable to benefit from it until technology caught up. The presence of the letter added a particularly disturbing element to the case, suggesting the perpetrator had felt confident enough to taunt law enforcement while remaining unidentified. The breakthrough came in 2022 when DNA was successfully extracted from the letter and analyzed using modern techniques. The genetic profile was then compared against genealogical databases using forensic genetic genealogy methods. This analysis led investigators to Scott Grimm, who had been living in the local area and had a documented history of concerning behavior, including a previous arrest for harassment. Grimm's proximity to the crime and his documented history made him a strong suspect once the genetic genealogy pointed to him. Investigators also examined clothing evidence that had been preserved from the original investigation, finding additional DNA that matched Grimm. The combination of the letter DNA, the clothing evidence, and the genealogical analysis provided multiple lines of evidence connecting him to Anna Jean's case. However, like several previous cases, traditional justice was impossible to achieve. Grimm had died in 2018 from natural causes, just 4 years before being identified as Anna Jean's killer. His death meant that while the case could be solved and Anna Jean's family could finally have answers, there would never be a trial or formal sentencing. Anna Jean's family expressed their relief at finally knowing who was responsible, but also their continued questioning about why someone would do such a thing. The letter that Grimm had sent, which ultimately contributed to his identification, revealed a disturbing mindset where he felt compelled to communicate about what he had done, while still believing he could avoid identification. The case was officially closed as exceptionally cleared due to the death of the suspect. The dark truth was that Grimm had lived another 30 years after taking Anna Jean's life, remaining in the same general area and apparently never facing suspicion despite his harassment arrest. The taunting letter he had sent demonstrated a level of confidence that he would never be caught. confidence that proved justified for over 3 decades until advancing DNA technology finally identified him. As of 2025, the case remains a powerful example of how even unusual evidence, like letters, can eventually yield DNA profiles that solve cold cases through modern genetic genealogy techniques. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would reveal a perpetrator with a disturbing pattern spanning multiple victims. Shannon Rose Lloyd. In 1987, authorities in Orange County, California, investigated the death of 17-year-old Shannon Rose Lloyd, whose body had been discovered in Garden Grove. Shannon had been a young person with her life ahead of her when she became the victim of a predatory attack. The case would remain unsolved for over 3 decades, but the resolution would reveal dark truths about a perpetrator who had committed multiple similar offenses and evaded justice for years. Shannon's case bore similarities to other incidents in the Orange County area during the same time period, suggesting the possibility of a serial offender operating in the region. Forensic evidence was collected from the scene, including biological material that would be preserved using the methods available in the late 1980s. Despite extensive investigation at the time, no suspect was identified, and the case eventually went cold as leads were exhausted. The investigation involved interviewing anyone who might have seen Shannon or noticed suspicious activity in the area where her body was discovered. Detectives explored various theories and followed numerous leads, but the forensic technology of the 1980s was insufficient to extract usable DNA profiles that could be searched against databases. The case file remained open, with investigators periodically reviewing it over the decades hoping for new developments. For over 30 years, Shannon's family lived without knowing who had taken her life or whether the perpetrator had harmed others. The preservation of biological evidence from the scene would eventually prove crucial when DNA technology advanced to the point where meaningful analysis could be conducted. The evidence had been carefully maintained in proper storage conditions, waiting for science to catch up. The breakthrough in Shannon's case came through advances in DNA technology that allowed investigators to develop a profile from the preserved evidence. An arrest sample that had been collected from a suspect in another case was compared against the DNA from Shannon's case, producing a match that identified Reuben Smith as responsible for her death. Further investigation revealed disturbing details about Smith's background and activities. He had moved from Orange County to Las Vegas at some point after Shannon's case, and he had been involved in multiple similar offenses against women. The pattern of his crimes suggested he was a serial predator who had targeted vulnerable individuals over a period of years. Investigators discovered that there had been at least one other survivor who had escaped an attack by Smith, providing additional evidence of his dangerous pattern of behavior. However, justice in the traditional sense was once again impossible to achieve. Smith had died by his own hand in 1999, well before being identified through DNA as responsible for Shannon's death. His suicide came approximately 12 years after Shannon's case, meaning he had lived with knowledge of what he had done for over a decade before taking his own life. The reasons for his suicide remained unknown, though it occurred long before modern DNA technology would have been able to connect him to his crimes. Investigators and family members expressed frustration at how Smith had been able to simply discard lives and evade accountability, with one official noting the callousness with which he had treated his victims. The discovery that Smith had been connected to multiple cases, including at least one other fatality and one survivor, revealed the extent of harm he had caused during his years of criminal activity. The case was officially closed as exceptionally cleared due to the death of the suspect. Shannon's family finally had answers about who was responsible, though they were denied the opportunity to see Smith face trial or be held publicly accountable. The dark truth revealed was that Smith had been a serial offender who had moved between locations and continued targeting women, with his suicide in 1999 cutting short any possibility of him being identified and prosecuted before DNA technology advanced. As of 2025, Shannon's case stands as one of multiple offenses connected to Smith through DNA analysis conducted decades after his death. But the next case would involve two victims and a groundbreaking use of technology. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. In November 1987, 18-year-old Jay Cook and 20-year-old Tanya Van Cuylenborg traveled from British Columbia to Washington State on what should have been a routine trip to purchase furnace parts for Tanya's family business. The couple never returned home, and their bodies were discovered in separate locations days later. Jay was found in Snohomish County while Tanya was discovered in Skagit County, both having been the victims of a violent attack. The investigation revealed that the couple had been traveling in Jay's van when they encountered their killer. The vehicle was later found abandoned, and forensic evidence was collected from both crime scenes and from the van. The evidence included biological material that would prove crucial decades later, though the forensic technology of 1987 was insufficient to identify a suspect through DNA analysis. Authorities from multiple jurisdictions worked together on the investigation. Despite extensive efforts, including interviews and exploration of various theories, no suspect was identified. The case became one of the most frustrating unsolved double incidents in the Pacific Northwest. With two young lives cut short and their families left without answers for over 30 years. The breakthrough in this case would prove revolutionary for forensic science. In 2018, investigators used forensic genetic genealogy, uploading the perpetrator's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database. This was one of the first cases where this technique was successfully applied to identify a killer, coming shortly after the Golden State Killer case had demonstrated the power of this approach. The genetic genealogy analysis built family trees going back multiple generations, identifying relatives who had innocently uploaded their DNA for ancestry purposes. These family trees eventually led investigators to William Earl Talbot II, a truck driver who had been living in the area at the time. Further investigation revealed that Talbot had a history that included time spent incarcerated for other offenses, and his occupation as a truck driver had given him mobility across the region. Investigators conducted surveillance on Talbot and collected DNA from items he discarded, confirming the match to the biological evidence. The scientific evidence was overwhelming, providing definitive proof of his involvement. Talbot was arrested and charged, and the case proceeded to trial where prosecutors presented the genetic genealogy evidence along with other forensic findings. The defense attempted to challenge the use of genetic genealogy and raised privacy concerns, but courts upheld the technique as valid. Talbot was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for both cases. Investigators noted that tips about Talbot had been treated like any other lead, reflecting the methodical approach that had characterized the decades-long effort. The families expressed relief at finally having answers after more than 3 decades. The dark truth revealed was that Talbot had been living freely for over 30 years after taking 2 young lives, during which time his familiarity with prison suggested he had continued engaging in criminal activity. His work as a truck driver had provided him with mobility that may have facilitated additional offenses. As of 2025, Talbot remains incarcerated, serving his life sentences, and the case stands as a landmark in the application of genetic genealogy to solve cold cases. Another case would involve a different kind of breakthrough decades after the crime. Michelle Welch. In March 1986, authorities in Tacoma, Washington, responded to a park where a young person had been found deceased. The victim had been at the park earlier in the day before disappearing, with family members frantically searching when she failed to return. The discovery launched an investigation that would span over 3 decades before modern DNA technology would finally identify who was responsible. Forensic evidence was collected from the scene and from the victim, including biological material that was preserved using the methods available in the mid-1980s. The investigation involved extensive interviews with park visitors, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen suspicious activity in the area. Despite these efforts, and despite the Tacoma Police Department's dedication to solving the case, no suspect was identified using the investigative tools available at that time. For 32 years, the case remained unsolved, becoming one of Tacoma's most haunting cold cases. The victim's family never gave up hope that the case would someday be solved, maintaining contact with investigators and holding vigils to keep attention on the unsolved crime. The Tacoma Police Department formed a cold case unit in 2009, and this case became one of their priorities for review and reinvestigation. The breakthrough came in 2018 when genetic genealogy was applied to DNA evidence from the case. The DNA profile was uploaded to genealogical databases, and analysts worked to build family trees that would lead to the perpetrator. This painstaking genealogical work eventually identified Gary Charles Hartman as a potential suspect. Hartman had been living in the Tacoma area and working as a nurse, presenting an outward appearance of normalcy while keeping his past actions hidden. Investigation into Hartman's background revealed a troubled history, including experiences during childhood that had apparently contributed to his later behavior, as well as struggles with addiction. However, these background factors did not excuse his actions or diminish his responsibility for what he had done. Investigators needed to confirm the genetic genealogy findings with a direct DNA sample from Hartman. The confirmation came through surveillance when investigators observed Hartman discarding a napkin at a location he had visited. The DNA from the napkin was analyzed and compared to the biological evidence from the case, producing a match that provided scientific certainty of his involvement. Hartman was arrested and charged with taking the young person's life 32 years earlier. During the investigation and legal proceedings, Hartman reportedly made statements to a coworker about the case, essentially confessing to his involvement. These statements, combined with the DNA evidence, provided a strong case for prosecution. Hartman ultimately pleaded guilty rather than proceeding to trial, accepting responsibility for what he had done over 3 decades earlier. During sentencing, Hartman addressed the court and the victim's family, stating that God knew he was sorry for what he had done. However, his expression of remorse came far too late to prevent the decades of pain experienced by the family or to restore what had been lost. The court sentenced Hartman to 26.5 years in prison, reflecting both the severity of taking a life and considerations about his age and the decades that had passed since the crime. As of 2025, Hartman remains incarcerated, serving his sentence. The next case would involve another Tacoma incident with its own unique circumstances. Jennifer Bastian. In August 1986, just months after the previous Tacoma case, authorities responded to another incident at a different park where another young person had disappeared while riding a bicycle. The victim had gone to the park and failed to return home, prompting an extensive search by family, community volunteers, and law enforcement. The discovery of remains weeks later confirmed the worst fears and launched another investigation that would last for decades. The case bore some similarities to the earlier Tacoma incident from March of that same year, leading to initial speculation about whether the same person might be responsible for both. However, forensic analysis would eventually reveal that the biological evidence from the 2 cases came from different individuals, meaning Tacoma had experienced 2 separate tragedies within months of each other, rather than a single serial offender. Forensic evidence was collected and preserved, including biological material from a swimsuit that had been part of the evidence. The investigation involved processing tips from the community, interviewing potential witnesses, and exploring various theories. Despite extensive efforts by the Tacoma Police Department's cold case unit formed in 2009, no suspect was definitively identified for many years. The breakthrough came when genetic genealogy techniques were applied in 2015, with the analysis listing the surname Washburn as connected to the DNA profile. This finding directed investigators' attention toward individuals with that surname who had been in the Tacoma area in 1986. The investigation eventually focused on Robert D. Washburn, who had been a Tacoma resident at the time before later moving to Eureka, Illinois. Interestingly, Washburn had previously contacted authorities to provide a tip about the earlier March case, attempting to appear helpful and concerned about public safety. This behavior of inserting oneself into an investigation was recognized by experienced detectives as sometimes indicating guilty knowledge or involvement in similar crimes. When investigators connected Washburn to the August case through genetic genealogy, they recalled his earlier contact about the March incident. Further investigation revealed that Washburn had voluntarily provided a DNA sample back in 1985 for an unrelated matter. When investigators located this sample from decades earlier and compared it to the biological evidence from the swimsuit found in the August case, it produced a definitive match. The sample that Washburn had provided 33 years earlier, never imagining it would connect him to a future crime, became the key evidence proving his involvement. Washburn was arrested in 2018 and charged with taking the young person's life. He ultimately pleaded guilty rather than proceeding to trial, accepting responsibility for what he had done 32 years earlier. The court sentenced him to 27 years in prison, a substantial sentence that would keep him incarcerated well into old age. The victim's mother spoke about how she had never given up hope that the case would be solved, expressing gratitude for the resolution. The dark truth revealed was that confusion about the two separate Tacoma cases in 1986 had initially delayed progress, with some investigative resources being directed toward finding a single perpetrator, when in fact, two different individuals were responsible. Additionally, Washburn's attempt to insert himself into the investigation of the March case by providing a tip demonstrated a disturbing pattern of behavior where he sought to monitor law enforcement's progress while keeping his own involvement in the August case hidden. As of 2025, Washburn remains incarcerated, serving his sentence. But the next case would remain partially unresolved, even decades later. Tracy Gilpin. In 1986, authorities in Massachusetts investigated the disappearance of 15-year-old Tracy Gilpin, who had last been seen in the Chelmsford area. The case would eventually be connected to the discovery of remains, and the investigation would reveal complex circumstances involving multiple individuals and theories that would take decades to unravel. The path to identifying a perpetrator would involve numerous twists and face ongoing legal challenges, even into 2025. The investigation established that Tracy had spent time with several individuals on the night before she disappeared. Forensic evidence collected from the scene where remains were discovered included biological material and other physical evidence that would be preserved for future analysis. The case involved multiple potential suspects and theories, making it one of Massachusetts' most complex cold case investigations. One particularly challenging aspect of the forensic evidence was that biological material found on clothing did not match the primary suspect, creating questions about what exactly had occurred and who had been involved. Additionally, investigators found evidence suggesting the use of a heavy object, specifically a 73-pound boulder that had caused significant trauma. The circumstances suggested a disturbing level of planning and effort in the commission of the crime. For over 30 years, Tracy's family sought answers about what had happened and who was responsible. Tracy's sister spoke publicly about finally seeing justice within reach. When developments in the case brought renewed hope for resolution. The investigation involved reviewing numerous theories, including potential involvement by individuals named McLean and Meinholz, who had been considered at various points. The case took a significant turn in 2018 when Michael Hand was arrested and charged in connection with Tracy's death, who had cognitive issues including below-average intellectual capacity and problems with memory and impulsivity, had a history of minor criminal offenses. He had worked as a stone sculptor for 20 years and had been living self-sufficiently. Notably, Hand had hosted Tracy and other individuals at his residence the night before she disappeared. During interrogations, Hand reportedly made statements that were interpreted as admissions, including references to throwing a rock. However, these statements would later become the subject of intense legal scrutiny. Hand underwent polygraph examinations and extensive questioning, with the interrogations continuing over multiple sessions. The stress and duration of these interrogations would later be cited as factors affecting the reliability of statements made during them. In October 2024, a significant legal development occurred when an appellate court suppressed a confession that Hand had made to a pastor, ruling that the confession had been obtained through coercion related to the earlier police interrogations. The court found that Hand had been subjected to fatigue and pressure during questioning, and that his subsequent confession to a religious figure had been tainted by this improper interrogation. This suppression of key evidence complicated the prosecution's case significantly. As of 2025, Hand's case remains ongoing, with his trial delayed by appeals and legal arguments about the admissibility of evidence. He has been denied bail multiple times and remains in custody awaiting resolution of the legal proceedings. The biological evidence that did not match Hand continues to raise questions about whether others were involved, or whether there are aspects of the case that remain unexplained. The dark truth in Tracy's case is that even with an arrest made in 2018, over 30 years after her death, the legal proceedings remain unresolved as of 2025. The suppression of confession evidence and the complex forensic findings have created ongoing uncertainty about whether traditional justice will ultimately be achieved. The final case would reveal perhaps the darkest truth of all. Christine Jessup. In October 1984, authorities in Ontario, Canada, investigated the disappearance of a young person from the Queensville area. The victim had disappeared while alone at home, and the subsequent discovery of remains launched one of Canada's most notorious criminal investigations. The case would eventually involve a wrongful conviction, decades of investigation, and ultimately a stunning revelation about who had actually been responsible. The initial investigation led to the arrest and prosecution of Guy Paul Morin, a neighbor of the victim's family. Despite maintaining his innocence, Morin was convicted and imprisoned. However, he continued to fight the conviction through appeals, and eventually DNA testing proved definitively that he had not been the perpetrator. Morin was exonerated and released, receiving a substantial settlement for his wrongful conviction. While Morin's exoneration brought him relief, it left the victim's family and investigators back at the beginning. The case remained unsolved for many more years, with the DNA evidence showing that an unknown individual had been the actual perpetrator. The evidence was preserved, waiting for technology to advance. The breakthrough came in 2020 when the DNA profile was uploaded to GED-Match, the genealogy database that had been used to solve numerous other cold cases. The genetic genealogy analysis eventually identified Calvin Hoover as matching the biological evidence. The identification was shocking because Hoover had been an acquaintance of the victim's family, someone they had known and trusted. Investigation into Hoover's background revealed deeply disturbing details. Hoover had apparently kept close tabs on the investigation and the prosecution of Morin, monitoring the case's progress through the years. He had been married and living what appeared to be a normal life while keeping his terrible secret. The realization that he had watched an innocent man be convicted and imprisoned while remaining silent added an additional layer of horror. However, traditional justice was once again impossible to achieve. Hoover had died by his own hand in 2015 at age 59, 5 years before being identified through genetic genealogy. The reasons for his suicide remained unknown, though it occurred long before DNA technology would identify him. When authorities announced the identification, the victim's father expressed that it came as a bit of a shock to learn that someone they had known had been responsible. The revelation that a family acquaintance had committed such an act while maintaining a relationship with the family added profound pain. Investigators also noted potential connections to other unsolved cases, including the disappearance of Nicole Morin, suggesting Hoover might have been responsible for additional crimes. Media reports described Hoover as representing pure evil, noting how his actions had not only taken a young life, but had also contributed to the wrongful conviction of an innocent man. The dark truth revealed was multi-layered. Hoover had been a trusted acquaintance who betrayed that trust in the most horrific way. He had monitored the case for decades while remaining silent as an innocent person was convicted, and he had taken his own life before modern science could identify him. As of 2025, the case stands as a powerful example of both the importance of DNA evidence in preventing wrongful convictions and the frustration when guilty parties die before being held accountable. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.